Welcome back, everybody. Good, perfect. Welcome back. We will try to battle your after lunch dip by having a great session about nature-based solutions for land and water management in urban and industrial areas. So I hope you're all right with that. My name is Tim van Hattem, Program Leader Green Climate Solutions at Wageningen University and Research. I will moderate the session, and we have two very inspiring speakers today, Marco Roos and Thomas Hartmann. And I would like to welcome Marco Roos first from Naturalis Biodiversity Center to tell us everything about biodiversity in cities. I read you love seeing animals and plants in cities. What is the most exciting plants you have ever seen in the city? Okay.
Grown over water.
Wow.
That's one of the best things.
Sounds great. Well,
does my mic work?
No.
Oh,
You have to switch it on.
Then does it work now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. My name is Marco Roos. The affiliation is not right in the program booklet because that is somebody with the same family name and the same initials from the LUMC. But I am Marco Roos from Naturalis and also the University of Leiden. Never mind. And my special focus is on urban biodiversity and policies. I'm also talking here on behalf of Hans van der Made, who is an urban planner of the municipality of Amsterdam, who unfortunately couldn't make it this afternoon. And he is one of the authors of the integral planning and design method for public space, which has been developed in Amsterdam and has also been prize-winning internationally. Okay, I will talk about biodiversity in the city. And, biodiversity is hot. If you look at all kinds of prospectuses, buildings are decorated with luxurious green, biodiversity is all over, and inbuilt facilities for birds, bees, and bats have been added to every new design. So, biodiversity we need. However, this is the reality. Artificial turf, fully paved gardens with pot plants, exotic pot plants, stony and town quarters, large industrial sites, fences to prevent birds from breeding. And of course this looks nice, but it are all pot plants which are exotic, and modern buildings are often what I call clinically dead. Hardly any living cell can attach to it. It might be circular, but it is not very beneficial for biodiversity. And for clarity, first of all, what biodiversity is not. It is not a candy store of especially the pets, nice and cuddly animals. It is also not the commercial seed mixtures for pollinators, which are kind of McDonald's for insects. It is not designed and plannable urban green. It is also not just a scenery of plantings within strict boundaries. It's not only above soil, above the ground, and certainly it is not decent and neat. So, for instance, I heard on the radio coming to here that we need to plant a lot of new forests. And that's actually a farce. You can't plant a forest, you can plant a bunch of trees. But that is still a bunch of trees. A forest is a vegetation type, a mature vegetation type, resulting from a whole series of successional stages with developments in the soil and above the soil. So planting forests is actually a very false statement. Okay, I think it is clear that this is not what I meant with biodiversity. This is biodiversity. It is often hidden. It is small. It is spontaneous. You hardly see it often. It is because it is hidden, or it is undervalued, neglected, but often it is also disliked because people don't like small microorganisms. But that's the bulk of biodiversity, small and beautiful. Biodiversity is a very complex phenomenon, a very complex concept of a very interplay of genes, species, habitats, the ecological functions, but also a factor of time and space, surface area. It's not, it is interpretable. But first of all, it is the diversity of genes and the diversity of species. And the diversity of genes is important to have the flexibility, to give species the flexibility to adjust to the environmental conditions, also in the cities. So, and the genetic variation is depending on the size of the populations. But nowadays we have blackbirds in the city which are morphologically and behaviorally different from their original populations in the forest, and also their song is a few pitches higher than the ordinary song. Also, the wall barley is in the cities different from the wall barleys outside the city, which might have to do with the dispersal capacity of many pets running around and bringing the seeds all over, whereas in outside the city there is less traffic in that way. It's also species diversity. Of course, our interest is mainly in the vertebrates, especially the mammals and the birds. That's only a very small pie of the total species diversity in a certain area. The majority are invertebrates, 55%, mainly insects. Then you have the fungi, another quarter. So about 75% of all living organisms in species are fungi or invertebrates. And then you have the algae, the bacteria, the plants, and only a very minor part are the vertebrates. And if we look at the biomass, the living mass of organisms in a certain area, then 80% is plant biomass. 15% is bacterial biomass. You wouldn't expect it, but bacteria are a major part of the ecosystem, also in biomass. And if you look, you hardly see the orange pie of the vertebrates. The biomass of the vertebrates is almost neglectable in a full ecosystem. Then, of course, biodiversity is habitat diversity. And this is just a few examples of the different biotopes you can find in a city. The rough city with the ports and the railways and the industrial sites. You have the stony city and also the more green and open areas in the city. That are just some examples. But biodiversity is also functional ecologically, but also in ecosystem services to humankind. In the soil, you have a very intricate, very specious and very biomass-rich food web. Not a pyramid, but a food web in which all organisms interplay with each other. And that is about a high number of organisms you can see here. The number of bacteria in a square meter of soil is enormous. Also, the biomass is large per hectare. And if you count this, then in a hectare of a nice ecosystem, you have 2 to 3 elephants buried as living mass in the soil. We are really talking about something. And the number of individuals, the number of biomass, and also the number of species is enormous in just an ordinary soil. Also, a soil is three-dimensional. You have different root systems, and so the soil is partitioned between the different plant species. It has an horizontal gradient of different organisms. The lowest are, of course, the most minute, especially in the litter layer and the surface layer, you have much more of what we call macrofauna. And then, of course, there is this worldwide root web of the fungi and trees and other plants which are connected. And actually there are signals going from one tree to another and from one plant to another and also from the fungi to another. For instance, if there is a mast fruiting, often the trees which do that are interconnected through the same ectomycorrhizal fungi. Now, to point attention to this phenomenon of soil, this neglected phenomenon of urban soils, we have published this book, Naturalis, together with the municipality of Amsterdam, to show the aspects, the importance, but also how to deal with soil of urban soils. And for instance, to show how important it is to have open soil, this is just an ordinary grass field of the in the neighborhood of the Wageningen University on the campus. And what you see is that in an ordinary lawn, there are bacteria, nematodes and fungi, and under the pavement, there are hardly any. And such a lawn is already a very poor ecosystem, but below a sealed soil, the life has almost disappeared, even microbial life. And then biodiversity has also to do with different scales in time and in space. Spontaneous processes shaping our environment. And the scale is from the city and its surroundings, but also spontaneous plant growth. The buildings are part of the whole ecology of the city, and even the pavements can be important at the scale of ants and snails. The small street plants, the pavement plants, are the corridors for the small animals. Trees are an element in the whole ecology and the spatial ecology of cities and their surroundings. And we are, of course, for many processes, we are talking about days and years, seasons, etc. But for the real development of a vegetation and its accompanying soil, we are talking decennia and centuries. So in a few minutes, you can spoil the development of centuries of vegetation and soil. And also in the cities, and below the soil, you have the scales of the macrofauna, the microfauna, and the microbes, including the corridors and the holes they dig and they need and also for the hydrology and the aeration of the soil. So different scales above the soil, different scales below the soil, and this enormous amount of scales in time. Biodiversity has also to do with interactions. The habitat is an interaction of the organism and its environment, but also the coexistence. And especially indigenous trees have a large amount of coexistence with insects, fungi, and other organisms. For instance, the willow, the oak, the birch, and the elder are among the most species-rich indigenous trees, with a high index of accompanying biodiversity. Exotic trees lack such an amount of accompanying species. And each tree has its ecological amplitude. They differ in CO2 capture, but also in hydrological capacities, etc. And often we are now thinking of we have to adapt the city to the climate change. So we have to import the trees from other areas. But an ordinary poplar tree or an ordinary oak tree has an enormous distribution area. We are only at the edge of the distribution area. They are into the Balkan with Mediterranean, into the Russia with the continental climate zones. So they have enough possibilities to survive in the cities. Actually, we have more to adapt the cities to a normal climate than to have our living organisms adapt to the climate of the cities, which is a corollary of our way of designing and planning the cities. What is especially important is the interconnection of all the elements, of all the spatial elements through corridors, and not only green corridors, but also water corridors, the blue corridors, or the brown open soil corridors. And often neglected, we also need dark corridors for the night moth and for the bats, etc. The night dwelling organisms are often distracted by our streetlights. Again, the scales and what is important are the gradients. No hard borderlines, but we have to think in gradients. Many people remove caterpillars and then they are sorry that there are no butterflies. So we have to think about the whole life cycle of organisms, that we don't remove or destroy one part and then have the consequences not thought out. different ways of ecological management, and just let spontaneous tile out, plant in is wrong. Tile out, plants come by themselves. That is much better for biodiversity overall. And how can we improve the conditions for biodiversity in the city? We have a lot of aspects: sealing, densification, compaction of the soil. There are a lot of urban aspects which we can mitigate. Mitigate in a way, as I have summed up here, to provide the basic business climate for biodiversity. And the basic business climate of biodiversity is determined by the availability of food, the possibilities to reproduce, and to be safe and survive as an individual to get the reproductive phase. So if we can provide this business climate for biodiversity, and here are a number of measures we can take which are essential, we can mitigate these negative aspects of urban life and increase biodiversity overall. And in the integrated planning and design method for Amsterdam, there are a lot of measures exemplified. The ecological matrix, the water matrix, the management type, and the soil is also a different thing. I just show it that there are already examples and references which you can use in a city environment. So my plea is towards a nature-inclusive city. That means that we might try to rewild cities, give spontaneous ecological developments their chance, and reckon with the pace and scale of ecological processes. We always are in haste. So we plant trees because we don't have the patience to let them grow from seeds. We sow herbs because we don't have the patience for the development of the vegetation by itself. And in that haste, we often spoil biodiversity patterns and take often a wrong direction. And we have to accept that there are new biodiversity patterns in the city because it is different from its surroundings, but that has also the chance to let novel ecosystems develop. For instance, on roofs, if we have if we increase the substrate layer on roofs, much more vegetation and much more biodiversity can thrive on roofs. If we are able to connect roofs, different layers, but also the city roofs with the environment, the surroundings of the city, it becomes part of the whole ecological matrix. And we have examples of an ecoduct, and I've walked canopy walks in the tropics, and that brought me to the idea that we also should try to develop an ecological and recreational network on top of the buildings, which of course has consequences for public space and privacy, etc. But it is a way to compensate all the built-up areas which are taken by buildings. So, referring to Hans' masterwork, we need an integral planning and design method for this public space to integrate mobility, energy transition, living conditions, the soil, the buildings, the trees, the whole environment in one integral model. That's what I wanted to tell you about my work on urban ecology, urban biodiversity, and I hope it will inspire you to think about these issues, maybe from a different way than you might have done before. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marco. Great talk. Great to think about the importance of biodiversity in cities. Maybe one small question, because I think that this goes much further than just thinking about nature-based solutions.
I think
How do
so,
you see that?
Yeah. Nature-based solutions are often regarded from a technocratic point of view, and I think this is much more from let it go.
Yeah.
In a way, nature knows best often.
Seems like it's totally different than we are acting now, but we come back to that later. Maybe there's one clarifying question. Nobody? Yeah.
Indigenous, yes.
So the question is, did you think about varieties of indigenous species?
Yeah, the cultivars, you mean. The cultivars which are often grown for a shape of crown which doesn't interfere with buildings, etc. Yeah, in a way, I am a bit cautious about cultivated trees because often they are genetically eroded because they are going through a genetic narrow, how do you call, funnel. And the genetic diversity is low, which makes them also vulnerable of changes in the climate, changes in the environment, and often they are exotic, also exotic genotypes, which are not common, not indigenous, and it's also a way of technocratic looking how we leave this space for a tree. How can we grow a tree which fits this space instead of what space does the tree need and how can we plan around this kind of minimal requirements for a sound ecology of the city? Does that answer your question a bit?
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Then we move to the next keynote speaker, Thomas Hartmann, all the way from Germany. But he speaks Dutch, I just found out. Thomas works at the Technical University of Dortmund and will tell us everything about urban flooding and the relation to private land. So I'm very excited to hear you.
Thank you very much indeed. I am very excited to be here today, and I would like to pick up where you just ended with the planning perspective, because I'm at the School of Spatial Planning at TU Dortmund University, which is one of the largest planning schools in Europe. And actually, I'm a chair of land policy and land management. So here's a bit of a tricky link, but we try to make the best of it. My talk today will be about urban floods and private land. And in particular, the challenges of implementing nature-based solutions. You will see in a second that my approach is a bit different. I'm coming from the implementation side, not so much from the ecological side, and we need to figure out how to mix them together. So I'm not sure where all of you are with respect to floods. I get passionate about floods in a weird sense, and that is because floods are one of the most expensive disasters that we have. And this is confirmed all the way from statistics of Munich Re, one of the big reinsurance companies, but also the IPCC report and everything. They confirm flood risk is really one of the major impacts of climate change that we need to tackle, and flood risk will continue to increase in the future. I make it very plain and simple in the following slides, and if there are hydrologists here, I need to apologize for the oversimplification, but bear with me with the argument. So if we look how we assess flood risk, usually it's measured in a centennial flood, a once in 100 years flood or something like that. So we have a certain flow, we measured in cubic meters per second, and a certain return period. So we have a flood event where you could put a dot in it. And then hydrologists and modelers, they put a couple of dots along this diagram, and they can then assess, these are the flood events over the last, I don't know, 100 years, or if we're lucky, and they can make then an estimation of what is the amount of water streaming down a river every once in a while, in every return period. Hydrologists, let's take care, the line is not a linear one, it's actually a logarithmic one, but bear with me, that's not relevant for the main part of the story. The main part of the story is that. So now we have a protection against flood risk management developed over decades. Gray infrastructure, these dikes are called, although they're not gray technically. But what we did over time, we built robust infrastructure. The Dutch are the prime example of Dutch Delft engineering, wonderful technical constructions. We have dikes protecting us against water, defending the water until a certain level. We tend to forget that, in particular in the Netherlands, I have to say, speaking up here today. A dike protects us against a certain level of a flood. By the way, the Germans do not have that high dikes, 100 years or 200 if you're lucky. But what does that actually mean? That means a flood that happens statistically in a certain return period, which we calculated back from historic events. That is the protection level that we have. So this is how we calculate a centennial level, and then the engineer puts a shovel of more sand on the dike or not in order to build the right height of that dike. And here comes the trouble. Climate change is changing this diagram rapidly. What happens is that this line moves up, simply speaking. Apologize the simplification, but simply speaking, what that means that a dike that withstands 100 years flood, or in the Netherlands, the one in 1,250 years flood, that withstands that flood nowadays will not withstand the same return period in the future. In other words, dikes will overflow more often, and all other technical infrastructure will. Technical infrastructures reaches boundaries. And we know that, and we try to tackle that, and we try to push that down again. Nature-based solutions are considered like a panacea to solve this. They are debated all along in all the academic and professional debates, but also very simplified, talking mainly about river floods. What happens is we can retain the water before it reaches the streams in the hinterland by afforastrations, changing the way we do agriculture, retaining the water. That would be the first one. These measures look a bit like that. You could tell more about that. For me, it's a bit of chunk of wood and a bit of grass, but it holds water back. That's the exciting part of it. Not for the extreme events, though. But then, if that doesn't succeed, we have the chance to retain water along the rivers in big retention sites that we can flood control. But let me tell you, this is also not enough. All of a sudden, the water will reach the urban areas, and that's the center of what I'm talking about today. If we want to flood cities, we better prepare them. We call that then the resilient city. A typical measure would look to a layperson's eye like a ditch. This is one in Riga, this is just a ditch retaining water, representing now multiple measures for the sponge city. And here's where it becomes tricky from a planning and implementation perspective, because we need to dig this ditch, maintain it, and so forth. And this is why I want to talk with you about urban floods and private land. We'll elaborate in a second why private land and the challenges of implementation. I will talk about 3 challenges, to keep it very simple. So here's the first one. Nature-based solutions, embraced and celebrated as the solution to fight flood event and other climate impacts, heat islands and whatnot. Nature-based solutions, basically all of them, they need more land. And you just illustrated that with the tree example very nicely. So basically all nature-based solutions, they require more land. In a European network, a cost action, we elaborated on that. It's called Land for Flood. This is the commercial break part of this talk. So Land for Flood, it's a network that still exists. I will come back to that in a second. Within Land for Flood, we gathered academics and practitioners from all across Europe and beyond, and worked on nature-based flood risk management. I'm very lucky that in the end we came up with special issues, books and stuff and whatnot, but I would like to talk about one special publication. I'm very lucky that the key author of that publication is here today. Pavel, show your hand. Pavel, here in the back, hiding over there, talk to him later. He brought together all these academics trying to explore in this paper nature-based solutions in flood risk management, in particular looking at the implementation barriers of these nature-based solutions. And it was really bringing together an expertise from all across Europe. It was a very long project. Pavel will tell you all about this. But I would like to talk about a specific part of it. And that is we made an inventory of these nature-based solutions, what there are, and there's a whole list of it. And I would like to talk today, of course, about, in particular, the urban nature-based solutions. We can distinguish them in two major branches. One is spatial water retention in urban areas, and the other one is urban water sensitive buildings. And because that's very tricky to remember, we can say the one is more or less the sponge city idea, keeping the water in the city, and we need trees and all this, all the ecology to do that. And the other one is adapting the city to the impact of a flood, the resilient city. Funny enough, the term that also comes from ecology. But these are the two buzzwords you will see flying around when we talk about nature-based solutions for urban floods. So the first message is all these nature-based solutions, they need more land. This is a first very important statement to make when we talk about nature-based solutions, because that's often forgotten. We like to embrace this green and nature, but we need more land. You showed that with this green roof very nicely. We'll come back to that. But most measures that we see, most pilot projects going on nature-based solutions, on resilient cities, well, they focus on public land. Very funny. This picture I use a lot in my presentations for these public measures, and it's just a few hundred meters from here in front of the new planning or geography building, a teaching building. And it shows, of course, a retention site on public land, a sponge city concept, if you want, at the same time resilient, because you can flood this small part, and once it's dry, you can walk across it again. But this is actually what we see in all the debate on resilience and nature-based solutions. They often focus on private land. And I was wondering, why is that? Why are we focusing mainly on the public side of it? Is that because that's ecologically the meaningful thing to do, or is that the most efficient thing to do? Let's ask Pavel and the colleagues. I was also one of them in contributing to this paper, and we developed in this table that I showed you barriers to nature-based solutions. So we have this diagram where we identify different measures, mainly for flood risk management, and we identified different barriers. And in order to make it very confusing, we used letters to allow me to explain it to you what they mean. We are looking at this part. So nature-based solutions for the urban realm, resilient city, sponge city, and the barriers. So what's behind these big bubbles that you'll see here, the major barriers for nature-based solutions to urban floods? Well, these are the 4 bullet points. What you see here, the word stakeholders immediately pops up, because in the urban realm, we are dealing with a network of complex stakeholders. Also, what you see are terms like trust, coordination, incentives, political will. They don't sound very managerial. They sound very governance, round table-ish. And we identified that lacking incentives, that lacking stakeholder coordination and trust of stakeholders is really a tricky challenge for implementing nature-based solutions in the urban realm. The institutional framework and the distribution of responsibility is in particular in the urban realm a real problem. Let me talk you through why that is. So let's look at the institutions for a second. So there are 2 major institutions, simplifying again here, when we talk about urban floods. The one is the water authorities, and the other is the spatial planners or urban planners. This is what links again to what you just said in your last slide. So the water authority is usually responsible for water, the abundance of water, dealing with resilience and sponge city, and spatial planning dealing with everything else. They have very, very different approaches. Water authorities are still very much management oriented. They're the engineers knowing the truth. I stop the sentence here. And there are the planners used to negotiate and balance different interests and aspects of all the spatial realm. So different forms of governance structures. If you look at water authorities, there are very clear hierarchies, very clear structures, management structures, trust and expertise. In spatial planning and urban design, we have then different aspects. Every stakeholder's opinion is taken into account and carefully weighted. And flood risk management, the sponge city and the resilient city are just one of the aspects. Now, this picture should help us to understand that there are two institutions at play in the urban realm about talking about flood risk, which don't even understand each other. They don't speak the same language, and it becomes even more evident if you look where they reside, where they live. This is the habitat on the left side of a water authority, a modest one. It's like castles, right? Have you ever been to Rijkswaterstaat? Oh my God. And then you go to a planning department and you feel compassion for these poor employees working in this asbestos functional Bauhaus architecture. Now I should be, this is of course two extreme sides, but it should illustrate the budget and the power of the two authorities, of the two agencies. But in the urban realm, when we try to implement nature-based solutions for the sponge city and the resilient city, we need trust, coordination, incentives, political will. That's the expertise of the planners. That's what they can do. They organize political will, they bring stakeholders together. Whereas the ones responsible for flooding, they're more of the institutional side. They know the expertise, you know. They don't negotiate the water level and their models. This is the truth. And this is conflicting in the urban realm. And this helps us to understand that if we want to implement measures in the urban realm, the best we can do is use land that's already in the public realm, publicly owned. Because once we try to do that in the private land, that is tricky, all these private landowners. But here's the trick. Land needed for nature-based solutions in the urban realm is often in private ownership. You mentioned the rooftop gardens for the sponge city, but also look where the damage is happening. It's not on the public road, it's on the private properties. So we need to identify private ownerships and talk to private landowners when we try to implement the sponge city or the resilient city. Because here is where the damage is happening, and here is where we have huge potentials. But because of the institutional setting, water authorities and planners, we focus on the public areas. We don't even use the full potential of it. I think that was a waving of a 5 minute, or was that the final thing? Okay, then I'll go on. So within Land for Flood, we after 4 years of looking at it within this group, we continue to look at it, I'll talk about it in a minute, we came up with key policy messages, recommendations if you want. What should we now do about this? Because we know nature-based solutions need more land. Measures are now focusing on the public realm, and we need private ownership. We need to talk to private landowners. How to do that? Here are some key policy messages summing up work of 4 years to a ridiculously small level, but this is what you could do. First of all, stop financing measures like building a dike or being very project-oriented, but focusing on the governance of private land for flood risk management. Take stakeholders into account. And stop financing measures means don't finance the dike that needs to be built, because the engineers of Delft, they know how to do that efficiently and quickly, and they will do that in a project-based way. This is great, but once the dike is built, it will not be removed. And it's tricky to implement space for the rivers or the sponge city after that. So don't finance the measures, but finance instruments for the governance for preparation of private land. Well, and then focus on the private land. This is the hard part. This is really the big chunk when we talk about urban floods. Flood risk management today leans too much on publicly owned land. And this becomes obvious when you talk to water authorities all along. And the final one, that is a tricky one. Getting landowners on board, this takes time. You remember the barrier of trust and stakeholder involvement and all this part. This is the expertise of the planning authorities. They don't have the power water authorities have. And we need to bring that together, take time to get landowners on board. These key policy messages are published in a policy brief published by the International Water Resource Association. So basically, to sum up and to your takeaway messages of the whole talk, which I will finish in a second, is first of all, nature-based solutions need more land. Second, focus on the focus currently is on measures on public land. This is not enough. And I hope that you will agree, because this is exactly what you will love when we embrace land in private ownership. Rooftop gardens, fantastic idea. But get the landowners on board, because they don't like that. That's more expensive, more maintenance. So these are the takeaway messages, if you want, of this talk. And I apologize for the passion I have for the topic, because I just cannot talk about anything else at the moment. Urban floods and private land. If you're interested in the topic, continue the dialogue. I put my email address down here, thomas.hartmann@tu-dortmund.de, or join the initiative Land for Flood. We're now continuing, although the funding has stopped by the European Commission. I tried. But we are continuing now, and you'll find all information on www.landforflood.eu. That was the true commercial break. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. A very passionate talk about flood management in urban areas, and I think there's a big challenge, if I hear you right. Maybe one thing that strikes me is that you say we have to take time to involve these private owners. And well, if I look around and see things happening, and also our wake-up call last year, also in Germany, the big flood in the southern part of our country, I don't think we have that much time.
I didn't say it's easy. Of course, this is challenging. Every flood manager says that we need a flood every once in a while to get memories refreshed, because then you can implement some measures. But that's, of course, a very saddest way on looking at the issue. Yeah, but in the end, we need to work with this institution of property rights that we establish and that we embrace in society. But we need to get landowners on board. There is no way around it. There's no alternative. And yes, it takes time.
So we have to start tomorrow or today or yesterday, as soon as possible. Before I ask Marco back on stage to have a discussion, is there one clarifying question for Thomas?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the very inspiring talk. So to bring these landowners on board, how do you do that? So also financially speaking, right? So maybe you can get us some insights on how should we do that, please.
Okay, I can mainly tell you how not to do it. There are many ideas floating around, from via reduced premiums for your flood insurance. But in the Netherlands, you cannot insure against floods, and in other countries, the premiums are too low, so that is a financial incentive. Then there is the idea of subsidies. But as flood risk management increases, we will run out of money first. Then there is the idea of payment for ecosystem services that revives after its hype in the 90s. That is a tricky scheme. They work on a small scale, and nature-based solutions we need on a large scale. So, yeah, I think we need more research on that. So no clear answer. Final point probably, I think, and there is a nice example from Pavel in the Czech Republic, or one of his colleagues, showing that it's not only the financial benefit that counts, but we need to understand landowners' approach to their property rights. So it's not only the finances. We have a case called the anthroposophic case of a landowner who just dug out holes to retain water for irrigation of these fields. And this in the end works out as a flood retention measure. So we need to figure out the motivations of landowners and understand them much better.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Marco, can I invite you back on stage? Compliments for your time management, by the way, because you were both right on time. I have a burning question for Marco, actually, and maybe for both of you, because I see you had a very passionate talk about biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity in urban space. But in the same time, I see in the Netherlands we have. Oh, that's. Oh yeah, we have to multitask. But we have to build 1 million houses in the Netherlands in a very fast speed in the next 10 years. And I think biodiversity is not always on top of mind of all the people that are working on this challenge. How do you see that, and how we are going to arrange that biodiversity is on top of their mind?
Yeah, the last thing is the same stakeholders problem as Thomas was talking about. I refer to the Zomergasten where our former Rijksbouwmeester was guest, and he said, well, the built-up volume in the Netherlands is large enough to house most people. However, we have to rearrange that volume. That is one approach. Another approach is that now we have buildings and the environment. We should include more buildings, more in the environment. One architect I was listening to said we have to learn to build ruins because they are covered with vegetation. They are full of spontaneous biodiversity. So we have to think more about that line of way of designing. But like the energy transition, I'm living near Leiden, and in parts of Leiden they already have planned and are executing new heat cylinder, how do you call, pipelines, etc. And we have to go on. So the trees come late; they come afterwards. So the way of to how to integrally develop and plan is still a long way. And the energy transition has 2030. As a time frame. Biodiversity has no time, no deadline, so that makes it a bit tricky.
If I may, I would like to add to that. So first of all, we heard the number of 1 million houses. As we know, this number has been largely influenced by the building lobby. It's less, but let's agree, it's still a lot of houses. Funny enough, I have some good news, I think. I made a study with colleagues from Wageningen University, and we worked out, is the large number of houses to be produced, does that go at the expense of the quality, and in particular biodiversity, climate change, and everything? The good news is that municipalities seem to not do that. They don't build on the expense of the quality goals. I'm not saying it's enough, but there is at least some hope, some silver lining here.
If I may add a mean answer, it's also if we build in agricultural areas, then we gain biodiversity, but it's maybe a mean answer.
So, okay. I'm pretty sure that raises some questions here in the audience. Is there somebody with a question or a discussion point? Not? Then
in January 1, a new environmental law will start. Is that a good idea? Because integration of everything is more or less in it. So is that also what you're looking forward to?
Yeah, you mean the omgevingswet? Yes, I think in a way it is a good development because it brings all data and all expertise together. But as I understand, how to bring all the data together is quite a menace. So, and then of course some data are more at hand than others. We know a lot of our biodiversity, but in a specific street or in a specific town quarter, we have difficulties to have enough data on that, whereas the data on building sites and pipelines, etc., are much more available. So in a way, it is a good development, but we have to take it with some care.
I disagree. In the Netherlands, there is this new Comprehensive Planning and Environmental Act. It basically brings together all sectoral and comprehensive planning within one law, one regulation. Why do I think this is not a good development? There are two reasons. First of all, we've seen that this idea of integrating every aspect of planning into everything failed already in the 70s when we embraced the idea of positivistic planning. This is the part of the planning theory lecture. The part of the political science aspect of it is by merging all the aspects of sectoral planning together with one plan, we take the debates between the different sectors, climate, environment, economy, out of the political and into the bureaucratic and administrative side. So the balancing act will take place within the administrative realm and not within the political realm. And I think this is unhealthy in the end.
I'm not disagreeing with you in that respect, because if we only think about quantitative data, we neglect the qualitative ideas. And we know what a good soil is. But if you have to bring in data in a way which makes it comparable with other aspects, then it often fails, because we have the general principles of a good ecology. We know that, and that's not depending on the specific data. And if we hang too much on the specific data, then we're always lagging behind.
The lack of implementation of biodiversity, sponge city and resilient city, I think it's not a lack of knowledge or a lack of data. We know what to do. Yeah. The trouble is to get it implemented with different stakeholders. And I would like to add on private land, but I don't go that far. So I think the main challenge is not bringing together all the data and the knowledge. We know exactly what to do. It's a question of political will.
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, private land. Because all the gardens in the Netherlands comprise 6 times our Oostvaardersplassen area, which is one of the largest nature sites in the Netherlands. So all the gardens together, and they're all paved, and we have an enormous amount of paved area in the private space.
Yeah. I see questions. Sure, it. Pass it to you. Sure.
So that's the government basically. That, right? What do you think of that? Is that a
So the question is,
yeah, are you repeat the question?
I try, but please correct me if I misread. So you brought in the example of Belgium, where it's mandatory to retain water on their own property, and whether it's the way forward is to enforce actions of private landowners. In part, I would say yes. I think you're referring in particular to the Flemish part of the, I think this is part of the answer. In particular, in my own field of planning, we tend to just love the idea to bring all stakeholders around a round table, close the door, and wait until consensus emerges. That is not how it goes. So yes, I think regulation is one important aspect of a strategy towards it, but it needs to go together with strategies of stakeholder involvement and all the soft measures, but also incentives, like the colleague mentioned back there on financial aspects. So I think in the end, it needs to be a combination, which will never be a perfect solution. It will be a bit awkward. And in my PhD, I call that, back then, I called that a clumsy solution. It's not working perfectly. But yes, I think regulation is one part, but in particular in Belgium, in Flanders, property rights are very, very well protected. So doing something against property rights needs to be very well justified. That's much easier in the Netherlands. You don't want to own land in the Netherlands, by the way. And the reason is that property rights is a very fundament on which our society functions, and touching it and regulating it is really something that is taken only with very much care. And we need to be aware of the institution we are dealing with. There's a good reason why we focus on public land when we do resilient and sponge cities, because nobody dares to touch the private land. Am I answering the question still? Okay.
Thanks a lot. You had a question, I think, or not? Was covered. Okay. Any other questions? I'm here. So.
You talk about the protection against flooding, right? There are times that the rivers don't produce enough water to have drinking water. So instead of protecting against floods, should we not make good use of the extra water we get at these flooding times?
I think you will be very much able to tell a bit more about the retention capacity of certain ecosystems. I think you're totally right in pointing this out. Why am I mainly focusing on floods? Because that's the entrance to get nature-based solutions realized. As we all know, nature-based solutions quite often have multiple benefits, including preventing droughts. But once you overload them with too many purposes, you deal with more stakeholders and you get them even more tricky to implement it. So my approach would be, let's start with the floods. They hurt. And we can convince landowners in the southern part of the Netherlands or in the western part of Germany at the moment about the importance of floods, because it just happened, a huge disaster. If you talk to them about droughts, I'm not so sure. I think you're totally right in pointing that out. I think that that many of the conclusions that we can draw from floods will work for droughts as well, and many of the measures will have multiple effects as well. Would you disagree?
No, I'm not, certainly not. No. But yeah, of course, there is no synchronization between our usage of water or a demand for water and the availability of water. And and the difficulty to match that is the chance to match that is to keep the water in the area, mature soils, well-structured vegetations are the best way of keeping water in the area. And so that's the way how we should develop it. And now we want to get rid of the water as soon as possible, at least for certain economic processes and purposes. And yeah, we have to change that.
Maybe an additional question connected to this for both of you. Is flood protection and biodiversity always a good couple? Because I haven't heard in your talk about flood management not that much about biodiversity. And I know, for instance, Rijkswaterstaat doesn't always like trees in the floodplain. So how do you see that? Is it a good combination, or do we have to be very careful about that? And how does it work in urban setting?
If we think about flood protection as making hard borderlines, then it is not matching with biodiversity. But if we can develop gradients as a kind of flood protection, and that's actually what in the oil polder happens, then it goes well together with biodiversity development. Like water retention is also a good match with biodiversity in most cases. So there are possibilities, but then we have to think in gradients and not in hard borderlines.
I would like to give two answers. The first is that flooding obviously is the more important issue. Now the serious one. So the other answer is a bit in line with what you just said. We need to stop to talk about flood protection. It's not flood protection. the best we have is flood risk management. And this terminology embraces the idea that it's about the management of a risk. It's like if you step in the car, you can have a car accident eventually. The airbag is not a protection against everything, it reduces the impact. And in that respect, nature-based solutions and flood risk management can go often hand in hand, but they don't always do. Think of a controlled polder where we don't indeed want trees or certain animals we don't want to have in a dike. But these are great infrastructure measures. One of the tricky parts, and this is where it really goes into different directions, is nature-based solutions. I put it in one of the first slides, is discussed as a panacea for flood risk management. Well, they work well for small and medium floods. An event that we experienced in summer last year in Europe, that would not have been prevented by nature-based solutions. Mitigated to a level that you would not even see. So in that respect, I think they often go hand in hand, or they do no harm to each other, biodiversity and flood risk management, but it's not the same. And flooding is more important.
Thanks a lot. I'm pretty sure that raises some questions, but in the meantime, there's already a Menti above your head. And with a statement, focus on private land. Like you said, Thomas, flood risk management today leans too much on publicly owned land. Well, I see 12 agrees, 2 disagrees. Pretty sure Thomas agrees with this. Who disagrees? Peter. Why?
Thought you would ask the people who agree, because that's the most, right?
Of course not.
I think there may be misunderstanding about what is publicly owned and what is not publicly owned. And the example you gave, I think, is privately owned land. It's university land. Most of the land in the Netherlands is agriculture land, privately owned. So this is a kind of dispute, so to say. But the point is very interesting. You need private land as well.
I had a question in this respect. What are the differences between democratic countries and more autocratic countries? How is the situation in China, where I think most land is owned by the government?
I will ask to both of you. You're right. The example I give from the campus area is formally privately owned land, but it's owned by a public entity at least. But you're right. You're right. The example is not perfect in that sense. The example of that area is actually a result of the watertoets, the water test in the Netherlands, where you need to compensate a measure that influences in the water body. So I will need to look for a better example, but what better example could I use at this very spot to show that? So you're right in pointing that out. But if you talk to water authorities, they still today want to have the ownership of the land for certain measures. And the reason for that is that convincing landowners to do measures is very tricky and very hard. And the idea of enforcing it is very, very tempting, but also very, very tricky for good reasons, by the way. Interesting that you mentioned China. China has a quasi-property, not a true property regime. But the basic functioning of many aspects of property work at least comparable to property regimes that we know here. There's a very exciting paper published in a special issue in Water International within Land for Flood, www.landforflood.eu, which discusses exactly this question. And we deal with the similar compensation problems that we experience in Europe. I think this is for you.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Biodiversity is what we need, but not what people like or want. That's an exciting statement. We see some disagreement in the room. Who does not agree with this statement? Why not?
I just want to share a very happy anecdote with you about biodiversity. It is what people want and what children now are being taught. My daughter is at daycare, and at the daycare they made their own insect hotels. So 2-year-olds making them and putting them in their gardens. So I do believe that it's very active, and this is just, you know, initiative of the ladies and gentlemen of the kindergarten themselves who are really invested in this and do this on their own volition. So it is what people want.
Want to react on that?
No, I think there are a lot of good initiatives, but generally herbicides and insecticides are well sold in our garden centers. So we still, and the nice thing is I'm working for Naturalis, and one of the items in our policy paper for the next 5 years is that in 5 years' time, everybody in the Netherlands should fall in love with nature. And then I think then we need a part of the policy paper trying to get people in love with the malaria mosquito or some other of our organisms which are generally, of course, disliked or disgusted. So we have to find a balance between wanted and unwanted biodiversity, and of course knowledge about the neglected part will help to show the whole array of biodiversity.
Do we actually know enough about if we want to have more biodiversity in cities? That also brings some more risks. I was last week on a One Health conference talking about nature-based solutions and all these things, and those people were mainly thinking about the risks of nature-based solutions, and not about the benefits.
Yeah, for instance, in Nijmegen you have an NVA program, Benign, which is about allergic reactions of plants, and one of the issues is how we can get rid of allergic plants in the city. So no grass to flower, no spring trees to get in flower. And yeah, if we are on that way, then I think we are looking for the wrong balance. So, of course, I was in a health city conference, and there they were talking about the risk of ticks in parks. Yeah, of course there are risks, but everywhere you go out, there are risks. And the best way is to control your body afterwards if you come at home, like you look to the right and to the left while crossing the street. That are, I think, automatic behavior which needs, but to get rid of shrubs in parks just because a risk, and you were talking about risk management, yeah. One extreme is to eradicate everything to get rid of the risks.
Okay, thanks. Great answer. Yeah, I think we go to the last Menti issue. But you both mentioned that time is really important. We need to take time for letting biodiversity grow, also to involve people and stakeholders to get support for all the actions we need. So we ask everybody, just share your thoughts about it. Well, how do you think we are going to manage it? Is that a good thing? Do we have time? We don't have time. We need some hard regulations. Who said that? I saw that too.
Yeah, I wrote that because I don't think we have time. So many people have been warning us for decades. Even before I was born, there was data on the way we are ruling this world. So I think we need some hard regulations to force people to implement certain things, and then the next generation will think it's normal. We don't have time to, in my opinion, to do really slow stakeholder management. And I know this is maybe a bit of a hard opinion, but it is my opinion.
I would like to have you on a panel together with someone from the European Landowners Association. And I just want to observe the argument. I think I understand what you're saying and why you're saying that. But we need to understand the other sides, and that's the institution of property rights, and they have a strong lobby. And I think the claim is correct, but the question is how to get there. And yeah, I leave it with that.
You can see them all, right?
Yeah.
Anyone that you
It's time. Now, what I was referring to is that we plant mature trees to give it a head start, and then think that the soil is also available, which belongs to a mature tree. So we can't, in a way, we can't force nature all the way. Of course, I can imagine that, for instance, in an urban planning, you want to have some speeding up, and that means that you can sow seeds on certain places and already give some trees a position, but let also room for spontaneous developments and let it grow in a more gradual, also time takes gradients in a more gradual way.
When we talk about owners, I see a lot the term acceptance on this slide, at least on the right-hand side, there was one. I think this is a valid claim if we talk the individual self-owned single-family house. But we need to understand that the structure of ownership consists also of large institutional owners, semi-public owners. And we haven't even started the debate of the structure of owners and their individual motivations when we talk about nature-based solutions. These two debates have not yet found to each other. And I think the first way is to understand ownership and ownership structure. And then I'll come back to the hard intervention. Then we need to develop dedicated and tailored solutions to these different types of owners, because an institutional owner or a huge developing company, an investor, will have different motivations and they need to be treated differently than the self-owned farmer or the self-owned single-family house owner.
Thank you very much. I think we have to round off a little bit. I got some instructions for that. But I think this was a great session. I think, well, you made it very clear that biodiversity is a must-have and not a nice-to-have. And biodiversity is not only something for nature areas, but also for cities. And flood management, flood risk management is really important. Other than flood protection, and nature-based solutions can play a really important role, but we need privately owned land on top of publicly owned land. And we need time, but we don't have time, and therefore we need regulations. And also a lot of messages about awareness and communication and involving all these stakeholders. So I'm afraid we have a lot of work to do as we sit here. No time to lose. So thanks a lot. Thanks for your great speeches and for the discussion. And we have some presents for you before we go to the pitches. With white powder. Thanks a lot.
organic wine.
That's from the Netherlands, but at least it's organic. Thanks a lot. And then we go to the pitches, Saskia.